Rule number 1 is never do anything for yourself when someone else can do it for you.
And number 2?
Rule number 2, in Japan, men always come first, women come second.
I might just retire to here.
No love for the boys. No love for the boys. If you're not my friend, you're a toy to me.
Masculinity. Noun. Possession of the qualities traditionally associated with men. Handsome, muscled and driven. He's a prime example of masculinity. Synonyms, apparently none of these according to... is this sounding vaguely familiar to you? Well, it should. Let's start with the good old 1980s, shall we? In an effort to counteract, or at least match the growing momentum of third-wave feminism, the need arose to feature characters and narratives in visual media that reaffirmed atavistic constructs of what supposedly differentiated man and women, namely masculinity and femininity. This act could be referred to as code maintenance, showboating heavily gender-coded characters in order to provide the consumers of said media a sense of comfort and normativity, during a time where gender roles were evolving and shifting beyond the socially constructed norm. After all, fiction only reflects reality, right? Men were largely hyper-masculine machines that used their imposing natural masculinity to either save the day, and the girl, or kill them off, depending on the genre. Even when men were victims in these films, they were rarely ever subject to what is known as the chase, a long drawn-out hunting sequence specifically created to satisfy the voyeuristic fantasy of chasing the girl. Males, in fact, rarely ran from the killer, and instead were killed quickly and in a far less elaborate manner. Displaying said ideologies on screen aimed to reinforce the notion of the golden past of gender roles, in which men and women occupied biologically determined spaces in a stable social system where everyone knew their function, everything made sense, and not a single person in the world ever questioned this or wasn't happy about this. Horror, married with the sci-fi genre, became the perfect tool to serve as a reminder to the masses that fixed gender roles were here to stay. That is, until the new man era of masculinity emerged during the 90s. Oh, and also 9/11. A visible effort was made during the 90s to expand acceptable performances of masculinity to also include traditionally feminine traits, such as sensitivity, vanity, and nurturing tendencies. However, this kind of response wasn't ubiquitous, and in order to maintain the patriarchal power structure, most attempts at progressiveness were still overpowered by narratives and characters that operated according to traditional gender roles and expectations. Take popular 90s sci-fi cinema, for example. In The Matrix, gender balancing was attempted by featuring a passive male lead and an active female lead. Yet, ultimately at the end of the film, the man still saves the day. In the sequel to The Terminator, the titular character himself underwent the new man treatment, transforming from a hyper-masculine villain to a protective father figure who, shock horror, is again still relied upon to save the day. Men were still intimidators or saviour figures, more or less solely based on their masculinity, whilst a strong female character essentially just meant adding on a traditionally masculine trait.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Or weaponising female sexuality. And, bad news first, this all got a lot worse after a particularly tragic event in American history. The September 11 attacks shone a spotlight on America that interrogated its weaknesses and its flaws for the whole world to see. America's own reflections of itself inevitably fed into the media of the time, and as a result, had an extremely noteworthy impact on how gender was portrayed in horror cinema of the early noughties, with a special focus on masculinity. The new man archetype of the 90s soon became subject to discourses surrounding the so-called crisis of masculinity. Said crisis of masculinity, however, can also be viewed as a mirror for the representational crisis of America post 9/11, reflecting the insecurities of the country in those it deems to shoulder the most blame. Due to the ingrained association between masculinity and power, and moreover the hero-saviour dynamic, masculinity in particular was looked upon with a magnifying lens. A new trend began to occur. Male characters in horror films who didn't conform to normative masculinity or rigid expectations of a patriarchal male ended up only being on screen long enough to display their ineffectualness before being killed or otherwise exiting the narrative. Running parallel to this was a rise in prominence of narratives featuring male characters being physically and emotionally tortured, as well as having the role of masculinity itself examined and deconstructed. Films like 2005's Hostel, for example, focused almost entirely on extended graphic displays of violence and torture conducted on male bodies, a far cry from the previous trend of men in horror films dying in a quick and simple manner. The special emphasis on the victimization of the male characters is noteworthy, as scenes of this nature in prior films were usually otherwise reserved for women. 2007's The Mist, an adaptation of a Stephen King novel, used a sci-fi horror micro-society setting to explore the aforementioned male hero dynamic and interrogate the role of masculinity and fatherhood. Despite the source material containing a more optimistic ending, the film ends with the hero defying gendered expectations and not taking on a survive against all odds mindset, instead choosing to mercy kill his friends and family before killing himself. To top this off, just before he attempts to kill himself, the character witnesses the rescue of another character from earlier on in the film, who left the group to find her children. Both of these events serve to metaphorically punish the lead male character for not acting upon set expectations of men in dangerous situations, to be the one that holds their family together and saves the day. Simultaneously, the continuous production of horror films in which the lead female is the sole survivor, surviving long past any of the men, whom usually die due to their incompetence, serves to puncture masculinity by reminding men of their supposed inefficiency in the face of challenges, or aptly put, horrors. This in turn stems from the perceived inefficiency of America in not preventing the real-life horror of 9/11, aiming to promote the importance and understanding that America has failed and needs to harden its resolve. Men and masculinity were thereby used as representatives for America. Using the concept that characters in films can be sometimes viewed as role models, a conclusion can be made that this is an effort to achieve the opposite, featuring an array of incompetent male roles in order to persuade men to not repeat the actions of the characters representing them on screen, serving as demotivational figures almost, rather than emblems of power and male success. A common discourse around gender equality is the implication that by elevating the position of one gender, another has to be lessened or repressed, which is really not the case. Why can't everyone feel empowered? When has negative reinforcement ever worked? Is this so-called crisis of masculinity really a crisis, or is it just a group of people voicing their unease at the prospect of true progress? Living in a period of time in which it is academic practice to understand that gender is fluid and can be expressed in a multitude of ways, why cinema is so hung up on only working within binary forms of gender and basing characters solely around either upholding or subverting gender norms is quite frankly beyond me. Gender is about as fictional as the lovely little ball of sunshine right here, and probably just as damaging. Masculinity and femininity are entirely social constructs, aiming to create apartheid between groups of people with actually incredibly minimal differences if you look beyond gender. The construct of masculinity is in fact a greater fiction than femininity, a more extensive hyper-reality, if you will, as it has fewer original sources within biology. If you disgendered absolutely everything, and taking into account that body parts are superfluous and interchangeable, then the only thing left that is truly masculine, aka exclusive to men, is the ability to fertilise, and likewise then, the only things truly feminine are the ability to develop life within them and menstruate. If a woman can perform a masculine action or behaviour, then it is no longer masculine, as a woman is able to do it. The word masculine suggests an inherent link to manliness or men, yet if multiple genders can perform the same action, then it becomes a gender-neutral action, as it is not exclusive to one particular sex. By acknowledging this, the aforementioned concept of a crisis in masculinity is rendered laughably obsolete. How can a system be in crisis mode if the system is completely man-made and imaginary in the first place? If real progress is to be made on screen, masculinity and femininity shouldn't be seen as constructs worth maintaining and utilising to this insane degree. The focus should be instead on creating characters and narratives formed around emotions, attitudes and personality types, instead of shoving them into tiny little binary boxes and then doing the best with what you've got. Allow women to be strong without having to exist within and appeal to the eyes of the male gaze. Allow men to show emotion and not live up to the restrictive chokehold of masculinity, but then not be punished for it. If what's on screen can only reflect what exists around us, isn't it about time that it stopped being controlled by the past?